Five, four, three, two, one. Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 20 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again this week by my colleague, Bill Roggio. Bill?
Hi, everyone.
Before we jump into this week's topic, I'd like to ask you, the listeners, to do us a favor. If you could jump onto the Apple Podcast app and rate our show, preferably with 5 stars, we'd greatly appreciate it. If you know me, you know I hate this sort of thing. I hate self-promotion. I'm barely on Twitter. Bill, you know that. I can barely even tweet these days. But this is the way
I can't stand it either.
Yeah, but this is the way the world works now, and it would help us greatly. I'm not a tech guy, but Phil tells me that there are algorithms. Phil's our techie guy, or guys who's helping us run the podcast. He tells me that there are these algorithms and the like that help people find podcasts, and that if you guys positively review ours, it'll help drive others to Generation Jihad. So that would be greatly appreciated if you guys could go out there and do that. We've already got a number of positive reviews, but we could always use more. And so with that, thank you. Now let's get on to the show. So if you guys have been paying attention at all to the news in recent months, you've certainly come across the Chinese Communist Party's campaign of forced assimilation and repression in the northwestern Xinjiang region of China. It's estimated that about 1 million, perhaps more, Muslims are being detained in a system of concentration camps. Yep, that's right. We're here in the year 2020, and there's still talk of concentration camps. These camps were originally conceived as Maoist-style re-education facilities, but they're now serving as forced labor factories where prisoners are made to manufacture goods for the Chinese state. According to a report released by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom earlier this year, the camp's former prisoners have described these facilities as a horror show, suffering torture, forced sterilization, rape, and other abuses. It's really horrific. And just recently, if you're on Twitter or on social media, as much as I loathe social media, you could see there have been images captured apparently by some sort of drones of Uyghurs being loaded onto trains and being shipped off to these facilities. It's just absolutely disturbing. Minders for the Chinese Communist Party are also stationed at mosques and within Muslim families in Xinjiang. They are forced to snoop around for any hint of religious extremism. But if you read about this or look into this at all, you realize that what the Chinese state defines as religious extremism really can basically include any form of religious expression. And you have a number of perhaps 500,000 or more Muslim children who are also been separated from their families and are being placed in boarding schools and other sort of re-education education facilities. In all, what you're seeing here in Xinjiang is a dystopian surveillance state. The Chinese Communist Party is using state-of-the-art artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology to help identify and keep tabs on ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslims as they go about their daily lives. And as I cited a moment ago, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom has documented this widespread digital snooping and has reported that it's not limited to Xinjiang or Tibet, where it's also being employed. These are the locales where this surveillance technology is being perfected, but the Chinese Communist Party hopes to spread it throughout the entire nation. In fact, they want to cover all the key public areas and key industries, according to that same report. Now, this is one of those things where life can imitate art, because the Chinese surveillance architecture began with something the Chinese Communist Party calls Skynet. It's an interconnected system of cameras that was installed around 2005 for the stated purpose of tracking down criminals. Now, if you're a sci-fi buff or a movie buff, you've probably heard of the Skynet of Terminator fame. It was that artificial intelligence system that launched a nuclear war against humanity.
Skynet has become self-aware. In 1 hour, it will initiate a massive nuclear attack on its enemy.
What enemy? Us!
Now, fortunately for all of us, the CCP Skynet hasn't done that. It's not quite as nefarious as all that right now, but it is pretty evil. Whole populations of Chinese citizens are now being monitored by this system in order to force behavioral compliance. Now, the Chinese Communist Party claims that these harsh measures are necessary to thwart terrorism, but that isn't really true. Bill and I and the Long War Journal team, including Caleb Weiss, have been covering the main Uyghur terrorist group, the Turkistan Islamic Party, for more than a decade. It's a real Al-Qaeda group. You know, Bill, some of these disconnected daughters, you know, these guys who try and pretend like groups like this aren't really Al-Qaeda, have tried to argue it isn't really Al-Qaeda, but you and I know it is. for a lot of reasons, right, Bill? We're going to get into that.
Yep, absolutely correct. I mean, the fact, its footprint, not just in China, but in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, should be, it's a global terrorist group, folks.
And there's no doubt that this group threatened to attack the 2000 Olympic Games in Beijing. We reported on the video at the time when it came out. The U.S. government and other sources have connected to other plots. It's probably responsible for attacks inside China, although that gets murky. The U.S. has also reported it's been linked to a plot against the U.S. embassy in Kyrgyzstan, way back when, years ago now. But the CCP's policies, Beijing's policies, go way beyond the terrorist threat of the Turkistan Islamic Party. In fact, the CCP may be driving more Uyghurs into Al-Qaeda's and the Islamic State's arms with its oppression than stopping terrorists. It may be forcing more recruits into the jihadis' arms than terrorists it's actually stopping. It's tough to say, but this is sort of one of the dynamics that we like to explore here on the podcast. So we thought we'd discuss that a little bit more this week, giving you an overview of the Turkistan Islamic Party and going back in time. Because here's the thing, folks. This is a real Al-Qaeda group, as I just said. It's a real jihadist group. It's a real terrorist organization. Don't dismiss that or downplay that. But that doesn't mean you can justify everything that Beijing, the Chinese state, is doing in Xinjiang or elsewhere. Hardly. And that's really the sort of the dynamic that Bill and I wanted to explore a little bit today. And we're going to talk about the Turkistan Islamic Party and its history. It was also formerly known as the Eastern Turkistan Islamic Movement. And, Bill, one of the funny things as we were preparing for the podcast this week that I thought of, as this is a horror show, as I said, but one of the humorous notes in all this is I remembered back to 2009. It was the first time I testified before Congress. I did testimony about the Guantanamo population, and it was a bizarre spectacle. I think there were 3 or 4 of us as witnesses, and 2 congressmen, one Mike Delahunt from Massachusetts and the other one Dana Rohrabacher from California, took this bizarre line that the Turkistan Islamic Party doesn't really exist. It's just basically a front to Chinese interests to discredit sort of the nationalism of the Uyghur population and their own sort of separatist movement. And I had to explain to him, look, Turkistan Islamic Party does exist. There's plenty of evidence it does. It's a U.S. and UN designated terrorist organization. It's its own independent entity. However, it is part of Al-Qaeda. And when I say independent, I mean it's independent from the Chinese state. It's not something that's some sort of elaborate cutout for the Chinese state. But apparently this theory had gained a foothold in various places, and I haven't seen it recently, but I remember being sort of interrogated on this many years ago now on this whole thing. And I remember also there was this human rights expert who I won't name her, but I don't doubt her intentions or her sincerity. But she was very angry with me for going through the files of the Guantanamo detainees and pointing out that, hey, these Uyghur guys who were detained there, their profiles don't match the nationalist separatists that you're talking about, that other people are talking about. That these guys really are jihadists and are part of Al-Qaeda. And this kind of goes to one thing I would say here at the outset, which is that, look, when you're dealing with a bad actor like the Chinese Communist Party or Bashar al-Assad in Syria or any other different actors that we're talking about, Vladimir Putin, it's true that their actions can fuel jihadism, can drive people to recruitment because it disaffects populations. It sort of it makes people wary of the state and can drive them into radical arms. But that doesn't mean that there aren't radical arms to begin with. It doesn't mean that there aren't radical groups, terrorist groups to begin with that can exploit this. And, one of the things we always talk, Bill, you and I, before we even get into this a little bit more, you and I talk about insurgencies and Al-Qaeda's insurgency. And one of the first things you learn when you start studying about insurgencies is that a lot of times local grievances can be refracted through an ideological lens in order to fuel an ideological insurgency, in order to fuel efforts to overthrow the state. Now, the interesting thing to me is that in Xinjiang in particular, we don't see a full-blown jihadist insurgency. We have some reports of attacks and that sort of thing, but we don't see a full-blown insurgency there. We do see the Turkistan Islamic Party's role in insurgencies elsewhere. I was wondering if you had any preliminary thoughts on that before we get into this.
Yeah, and before we get there, and I think first of all that speaks to, I think the Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs, of the Muslims in Xinjiang has been relatively effective, and this is basically what has driven them outside of the country and into the arms inside of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Syria, where they can operate, get their contacts, and work as part of Al Qaeda and the Taliban and other terrorist groups. The network there, it's part of the networking. It's the training. I believe they have an intention, or at least be reading their statements, they have every intention of trying to take the fight back into China, but they have not been very effective at this. And I think that's why you see a greater international presence with them. And, to back up one point that you had made, the just because the Chinese are a bad actor doesn't mean the Turkistan Islamic Party isn't a bad actor too. We've seen this very, very similar, if not the same dynamic in the Caucasus, with Russia and as well as the Islamic Caucasus Emirate.
And also in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, remember there was that theory that ISIS was basically just some sort of part of some elaborate game by Assad.
Yeah, exactly.
And it just doesn't make any sense if we get into it, but yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, look, the reality, people wanted to, sort of hold up the every Chechen rebel, insurgent, terrorist as being, sort of this, independent freedom fighter. Well, the fact is, and as you noted, these jihadist groups have a way of getting into the bloodstream of these insurgencies and often taking them over from the inside. And I think the Islamic Caucasus Emirates, which, is very, very closely allied, if not a direct Al-Qaeda, but undeclared Al-Qaeda affiliate, they were very effective in doing that. And, the Turkistan Islamic Party, it's bought into Al-Qaeda's global mission to establish a global caliphate and impose Sharia law, and it wants to do that in Western China as well. But it's just not at this point in time. It's not strong enough to have a significant impact. And that's what, by the way, which makes the Chinese. See, I think they're using the part of this, using the Uyghur threat, the Turkistan Islamic Party threat, to try and justify its concentration camps, which, by the way, it claims don't even exist, which is very humorous in itself. If it wasn't so deadly. And it's I just find it interesting that the Chinese, they, like you said, they're persecuting Christians, they're persecuting anyone who has all sorts of
religions. Yep. And Uyghur Muslims aren't the only ones. Absolutely, they're going after all sorts of because they see it as something that tears apart the cultural fabric of what they envision for the communist state. Basically, that's the way they view it.
Yeah, exactly. I just read how they're basically telling Christians, if you don't, denounce your views, you're not going to receive any type of welfare, aid, housing, any of those types of things that are provided by the state. I'm sure it's a lot worse than that.
So now I think you got into, correct me if I'm wrong, you probably started covering the Turkistan Islamic Party through the drone campaign in northern Pakistan and the war fighting in Afghanistan. Is that right, Bill? That's probably where you came from. Yeah,
that's correct.
That's where you got it from. So you saw the guys are being targeted and saw how these TIP guys were integrated into the global jihad there in northern Pakistan, that sort of cesspool that was brewing there. The U.S. had this drone campaign that was going after these guys. And I came at it from a different perspective. I started going out looking in these guys by studying the detainee population at Guantanamo. Bill, you remember I built the big database of all the guys who were ever held there and had all these variables looking through all the detainees, because Guantanamo was obviously very controversial. I find, maybe we'll do an episode on that at some point. But it's one of those things where you can learn a lot by going through the files that were produced at Guantanamo about how Al-Qaeda functioned prior to 9/11 in particular, back to the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And there were these 22 Uyghur detainees who were held at Guantanamo. Now, the Pentagon later decided that some of them were deemed no longer enemy combatants. The Bush administration basically gave up on defending their detention. The Bush administration I don't want to get into all the legal back and forth on all this stuff, but basically nobody wanted to go out there and argue that these guys were really part of the Al-Qaeda web. But we viewed that as one of these examples where the U.S. government becomes confused about the enemy, namely how to define Al-Qaeda. Because, look, I can understand if the U.S. doesn't want to detain most of these guys indefinitely. I think most of the Uyghurs who were held at Guantanamo were not, high-level threats. They were sort of low-level guys. Some of them, perhaps even all of them, made their way to Afghanistan in the first place because of Chinese repression. I wouldn't doubt any of that. But that doesn't mean that they didn't become part of the Al-Qaeda web, the Al-Qaeda-Taliban web. And what struck me going through the files was just how much evidence there was, including their own admissions during the combatant status review tribunals at Guantanamo, how much these guys really were trained to fight in Afghanistan. And when you just look a little bit further into what they were saying, yeah, they denied being Al Qaeda or Taliban, but if you look just a little further into what they were saying, obviously those denials sort of fell flat, fell short of being truthful. And I think the truth of the matter is that the TIP, the Turkistan Islamic Party, has fought alongside the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan since the 1990s. It's established a branch in Syria as well. We're going to get into that. But this problem of defining Al Qaeda and how you discuss groups like the TIP has continued to this day, right, Bill? I mean, we go through these U.S. government assessments of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan or Al Qaeda globally, or DoD assessments, Inspector General Office, and they always break out the TIP as a separate line item, basically, in their assessments, and there's no real explanation of how this thing fits into Al Qaeda's global insurgency footprint.
Yeah, it's a major mistake. I mean, especially since we know that TIP leaders have served in very senior positions within Al Qaeda, particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I never could understand why the Department of Defense and intelligence community always seems to want to separate the TIP out from the greater Al Qaeda network. It's mind-boggling, but there's a lot of things that, we deal with and that I'm sure all of our listeners are probably tired of hearing us complain about.
Yeah, this is the disconnect the dots stuff, right? This is the disconnect the dots stuff, right, that we talk about, where basically groups like this were sort of, there's the whole paradigm for understanding Al Qaeda. It tries to put this off in its own, groups like this off in its own world, and really, or sort of say it's loosely affiliated, when really it's been a core part of what Al Qaeda is doing in Afghanistan for a long time, close to the core.
One thing too that always just bothered me. I mean, we would conduct these drone strikes in Pakistan. They were usually on the Taliban compound, Haqqanis being a major part of the Taliban, of course. And you'd often see TIP leaders killed or wounded, or TIP fighters killed or wounded during these strikes. And, alongside of a Taliban, alongside of an Al Qaeda operative, an Al Qaeda leader, an IMU, Islamic Movement Uzbekistan leader, or one of the Pakistani jihadist groups. At some point you have to look at that and say, maybe they're all part of the same network, but there just always seemed to be a refusal to do that, especially when it came to the Turkistan Islamic Party.
Yeah, I mean, if they can fight together and they can die together, I don't know why anybody would pretend they're anything but comrades in arms,
Yeah, we even had that remember the Hakimullah Masood video, right? The movement of the Taliban in Pakistan put out. There were TIP guys we believe that were shown within those videos as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the Islamic movement in Uzbekistan. One of the things that stood out to me when I was reviewing the Gitmo files was that the analysts at Joint Task Force Guantanamo were reporting that, before 9/11, that the TIP was cooperating closely with the Islamic movement in Uzbekistan. There's one quote in one file, or a number of the files, it says that they've unified their efforts to form a larger and more capable terrorist organization, which is now directly affiliated and supported by Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And then there's another quote from those files produced at Guantanamo for the detainee population, says that the organizations, the TIP and IMU, that is, have extensive Al Qaeda ties and numerous affiliations have existed for several years with other Islamic extremist groups. So they've basically existed within that web all along, even though people have tried to deny that. And then, as we're reviewing for the show today, or getting ready for the show today, Bill, there was one former Gitmo detainee stood out to me. There's this guy, Ahmed Mohammed, who was transferred to El Salvador in 2012. I have no idea what he's up to today. But, the threat assessment that was written for him alleged that he actually worked for Osama bin Laden's top lieutenant in Afghanistan, Abdul Hadi al-Iraqi. And Abdul Hadi al-Iraqi well. I mean, that's a guy who was, he's still at Guantanamo. He's somebody that they've tried to bring before a military commission. But, if you're a Uyghur member of the TIP in Afghanistan working for Abdul Hadi al-Iraqi, it doesn't get more Al-Qaeda than that, right?
He's as Al-Qaeda gets. Al-Qaeda's top military leader, external operations. If you're his lieutenant, you may be Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. So I went through all 22 detainees there, and a lot of them admitted that they were trained in these facilities in the Tora Bora Mountains, which of course was Osama bin Laden's stronghold in Afghanistan. It's where Al-Qaeda fled to in late 2001 to try and escape reprisals from the U.S. And of course, a lot of terrorists escaped from the Tora Bora Mountains, including bin Laden. It's one of the reasons why that initial invasion of Afghanistan was not successful. And these guys, a lot of these detainees at Guantanamo, they admitted they were trained in these facilities in Tora Bora Mountains by Hassan Maksum and Abdul Haq al-Turkistani. Now, this leads us to the next part of this episode of the podcast, because we're going to talk a little bit about these two guys. Because one of the things you learn about the Turkistan Islamic Party, and you think about this whole war here in the post 9/11 war, it's had remarkably stable leadership at the tippy top, at the very top of the organization, because Hassan Maksum, he was the first emir of the Turkistan Islamic Party. He was killed in Waziristan in October 2003. Was that with a shootout with the Pakistani forces, Bill, I think?
Yeah, that was when the Pakistani military sort of made this half-hearted attempt to go after al-Qaeda in northwestern, really in the tribal areas, particularly in North and South Waziristan. And then the Taliban rose up to defend their al-Qaeda and other jihadist allies. Yes, he was killed, I believe, in a shootout. It was a shootout with the Pakistani military. We were not conducting drone strikes.
Right. This is before the drone campaign began. So
2005 was the first.
Gotcha. So Maksum is killed in this shootout with Pakistani forces there in 2003. Now, we follow al-Qaeda propaganda and messaging since then, and Ayman al-Zawahiri has very profusely praised and eulogized him, has been very, very effusive in his praise, I should say. In his statements, he's lauded Maksum's fealty to the Taliban's Islamic Emirate and Mullah Omar. Basically, Zawahiri has held him up as one of these example of international jihadis who've come to Afghanistan and did the right thing by pledging allegiance to Mullah Omar and staying loyal to Mullah Omar. And that's basically the example, or one of the models that Zawahiri's held up. And Al-Qaeda, Asahab, the central media organ for Al-Qaeda, has also released images of Zawahiri sitting side by side with Maksum in a way to underscore their relationship. So this is the type of thing that Al-Qaeda is very loud and proud about in terms of what is going on here. They're not hiding the fact that they're behind the TIP, and we're going to get into Abdul Haq in a second here, but they're owning Maksum. Now, I remember back in 2009 when I first testified before Congress, Al-Qaeda hadn't released all that much about Hassan Maksum at that point. He was you can look back at the congressional transcript, you can see I say, I'm recalling this off the top of my head, but I think I said this. I said it was murky. His background was a little bit murky. I didn't really know all that much about him. I didn't doubt that he was in the Al-Qaeda fold, but I didn't really know all that much about him. Well, Al-Qaeda has released a number of things about him in the intervening years that sort of fill in the biography a little bit and show that they were with him all along. And Bill, you're covering the drone strikes that start years later in northern Pakistan. You see the TIP is working with the Haqqanis, the IMU, other groups in northern Pakistan throughout that whole time. They were basically embedded within this milieu here in northern Pakistan, which was the Al-Qaeda scene.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just in North and South Waziristan or northwestern Pakistan. It was also inside. We'd see U.S. military reports of killing TIP members. I wanted to say it was around 2009, 2010, and this was in northwestern Pakistan. In that instance, they're very likely working with the IMU, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and the Taliban in eastern Afghanistan with the Haqqanis. And then, of course, in North and South Waziristan and the other 5 tribal areas, the TIP would also be operating whatever Taliban leaders would shelter them. And again, like I said, they would be conducting meetings. We have video evidence of meetings with Hakimullah Masood and Tahir Yuldashev, who was the head of the IMU, and we believe there was a TIP leader in there. I think I've identified him, but I'm not certain, so I won't say it. And we've seen this time and time again. Those drone strikes, really shed a lot of light. It was basically, kicked up the hornet's nest. Once those missiles started detonating in Pakistan's tribal areas, you started seeing who was who in where they were and who they were working with. And the reality is they were working with all flavors of Pakistani Taliban, not just the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, but Taliban leaders who were not affiliated with the Pakistani Taliban or the Afghan Taliban, groups like the Hafiz Gul Bahadur group or the Mullah Nazir group. And these are those Taliban groups that are considered to be pro-government. I put that term in quotes, or good Taliban, also in quotes. So these are the Taliban elements that are supported by the Pakistani state, even though they are against the enemies of the Pakistani state. And the TIP has actually been targeted several times by the Pakistani military, but it's only come when the Chinese really start breathing down their throat about it. I recall one point in time, I want to say it was like 2009 or I think it might have even I can't remember. It was so far back. We're talking a decade ago. I can't believe it. Where, the Pakistanis came out and said, "Oh, we killed this senior leader of the TIP. He wasn't dead." But they did it like within a month after the Chinese really complained about the TIP. So the Chinese recognize it. They're estimated to have about 400 to 500 fighters in northwestern Pakistan at the time, and several hundred more in Afghanistan. I suspect
this was years ago, though.
This is far more.
Yeah, this was years ago.
This is years ago. Yeah, a decade ago. I suspect that number was higher at the time. I couldn't even try and give you an estimate of what that would be now.
Yeah, the U.S. puts out different estimates, putting their numbers in the hundreds, but nobody really knows how many fighters they've got. I mean, they're known to be in Badakhshan right now. We're going to get into that a little bit later, but the bottom line is we don't really know how many fighters they have. We are very suspicious of any sort of any body counts and any fighter counts, right, Bill? We're always suspicious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look, I certainly think when it came to the Pakistan estimate, there had to be enough of them to really get under the skin of the Chinese government. That's always, that to me was a key tell, that there had to be enough of them for it to actually be problematic. We weren't talking 10 or 20 here. That's probably something the Chinese would not worry about, but they're going to worry when those numbers get into the hundreds and they're starting to see evidence of these guys, trying to foment attacks inside of the Chinese border.
So ever since Maxim was killed in northern Pakistan in 2003, the TIP has been led by Abdul Haq al-Turkistani, his longtime comrade and partner. Now, here's where there's a tension between the way the U.S. government thinks about these things, or tension in how they think about these things, because Abdul Haq al-Turkistani was designated as a terrorist by the U.S. and the UN in 2009. The U.S. Treasury Department, I think it was at the time, reported that he was a member of Al-Qaeda Shura Council, which is, this elite advisory council underneath Al-Qaeda's emir. Doesn't get more Al-Qaeda than that. In addition, some of the Bin Laden files that we agitated for releasing, for the U.S. government to release, include these monthly ledgers that show who was on basically Bin Laden's and Al-Qaeda's payroll. And lo and behold, one of the guys who was on the payroll was Abdul Haq al-Turkistani. He was getting money from Bin Laden's coffers every month. You can't get more Al-Qaeda than that. So by 2009, the U.S. government knows that Abdul Haq al-Turkistani is an Al-Qaeda Shura Council member. After the Bin Laden raid in 2011, you certainly have files showing that he's being paid directly by Al-Qaeda senior leadership. You have a bunch of rhetoric, you have a bunch of propaganda, media, operational data. You can show this guy is clearly within the Al-Qaeda world, no doubt about it. But yet, the U.S. government Defense Department, and in terms of detainee policy, had basically given up by 2008 in defining these guys as the TIP detainees as part of the Al-Qaeda world, which shows you one of the tensions here in all this. And again, there are other issues with that. I'm not saying that these guys should have been detained indefinitely for all time, but it just in terms of identifying Al-Qaeda and how it works, there was a basic problem of definition there. So let's get into Abdul Haq al-Turkistani a little bit. Bill, I remember you were all excited in 2015 because the TIP came out of the video. I remember you calling me. You were all, this is how much of a nerds we are on this stuff.
We really are nerds.
This video came out. And, you had reported that Turkistani was thought dead. The U.S. thought they got him in 2010 in a drone strike in where?
In Pakistan, of course.
Yeah, northern Pakistan, right? Again, so he thought that he met the same fate as his predecessor, Hassan Maxim. But then, voila, here he appears in 2015 in a video to proclaiming he's still alive. And now he's alive, but he's been in charge of the Turkistan Islamic Party since recovering from his wounds, I think the year prior in 2014. Now, why'd you get all excited about that, Bill? Because this was a big aha moment, right? This was one of these places where we all of a sudden are getting pieces that we didn't have.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, this was one were the Pakistanis were touting his death, and because the Chinese, again, they were putting pressure. This is just one of the instances too. I mean, for me, it just shows the murkiness of the difficulties that we have in trying to deal with figuring out if these guys are alive or dead. And I always thought it was curious that we never saw someone named as a new emir for the Turkistan Islamic Party, for all of that time. I also got a little excited because he's just sort of one of those characters that I've always enjoyed. They did so, and I was wrong in my statement. They did actually name a new emir His name was Abdul Shakur al-Turkistani, but he was a temporary leader for the TIP.
That's the detail that got you excited at the time. I remember this guy was just a temp emir. Turns out he wasn't the real. He wasn't, and basically Abdul Haq was probably recovering from wounds, so he was probably
right. Exactly, and not just that, but Abdul Shakur al-Turkistani was also identified as a member of Al Qaeda's network as well. I think he at one point led Al Qaeda's. I'm going off of memory here, but he was a military commander for Al Qaeda in northwestern Pakistan, along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So, you had all these types of things there going on with him. And yeah, I get a little geeky about those things. I do admit it.
Now, Abdul Haq al-Turkistani's career, I think, as we were preparing for the show this week, I thought, look, here's another guy who really is a good example of the two of the themes you and I discuss all the time. And the first one is the longevity of some of these jihadis. And then the second is the uncertainty concerning reported deaths. Now, we just got into the uncertainty concerning the reported deaths for a little bit because, I think it was you, Bill, first said that if you don't see a corpse or somebody doesn't, cut off these guys' head and drive a stake through their heart, you can't be sure they're dead, right? You've been covering who's dead, or you've been covering the checkerboard or game board of who's alive and who's dead for a long time. You know how much a pain in the ass that is to do, right? And and this is a guy who, look, he thought he was dead and he wasn't. Here he is. He's back, right? They didn't put the stake through his heart. They didn't decapitate him. Here he is. He's back.
Yeah, Tom and I always joke, look, they're vampires. They come back to life when you least expect it. Got to drive the stake through the heart, chop off the head, expose them to sunlight as well.
Get your garlic out. We both
then.
have Italian roots, so get your garlic out, right? A little
exactly,
sauce,
exactly. Yeah. Get your crucifix. Yeah. And that only then and only then. In the case of Turkistani, both the U.S. government and the Pakistani government were certain that he's alive. Usually, a lot of times,
certain he was dead. Certain he was dead.
That he was dead. I'm sorry. A lot of times you see these claims and they'll just attribute it to some unnamed official. In the case of Pakistan, their interior minister came out and put his name to that report. So, that's the sort of the situation that we deal with. It is extremely difficult.
Now, to say that, but by the way,
especially during this time too.
Yeah, with those officials, by the way, look, they did get him, right? It just they didn't kill him. That's the thing,
yes.
Right?
They didn't kill him,
which is part of the murkiness here, right? Is that it's true. He probably was wounded in this drone strike. It's just how are they certain he was dead? That's the problem. And listen, that lesson probably applies to other AQ figures right now, right? I mean, there are potentially other guys who were thought to be killed or who aren't dead.
Right. And, and that also speaks to another. We think he's dead. They stop looking for him, but yet he's convalescing. And where's he doing that, by the way? Who has the infrastructure? He's an enemy of every state in the region. Where is he doing that? How is he, for 4+ years, he's able to hide from the government? It exposes a lot of problems, the lack of very good intelligence. I mean, I recognize it's difficult, particularly in extremely lawless places like North and South Waziristan, to actually know something. But, you had drones flying over the area all the time. You had an extensive intelligence operation with informants and electronic surveillance and all sorts of gadgets in order to try to figure out who was who and who they kill, who to target. And yet a guy like him, he not only did he survive the attack, but his convalescence was undetected for almost 5 years.
Yeah. So it just speaks.
I always found that to be amazing.
Just speaks to the problems here in assessing this stuff and the analytic problems in assessing what's going on. But on the longevity point, which is one of the 2 points we're talking about, just think about it. This is a guy who's been in the game since prior to 9/11. He's probably been in the game since the late 1990s. That makes him a 20+ year veteran of the jihad. 20+ years this guy's been going at it. He's still going at it today. Again, we always say, name me the U.S. personnel who've been in the game that long. It's few and far between. So look, he's still going at it. And, by the way, from Al-Qaeda's perspective, they're very happy he's still going at it because, as we reported back in 2016, so he reappears in 2015. 2016, Abdul Haq al-Turkistani comes out with a new video message. And he basically blasts the Islamic State's caliphate. So remember, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State, they announced the caliphate in 2014. They have various attempts at poaching from the Taliban, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Pakistan through time. One of the more successful attempts, initially at least, was to get the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which, as we just said, was closely allied with the Turkistan Islamic Party, and the IMU's emir, Uthman Ghazi, to defect, to basically join the Islamic State's caliphate and join Baghdadi's cause. Abdul Haq comes out in 2016 and says, no, Islamic State's caliphate is illegitimate. He blasts the IMU and its emir and accuses them, chastises them for initiating a quote-unquote war against the Taliban by siding with the Islamic State. And he pointed out in 2016, curiously enough, that the IMU had all but quote-unquote disappeared as a result. And we think, and we know what he was referencing there, right, Bill, was that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda came down and cracked down hard on IMU and Uthman Ghazi and the defectors who tried to join the caliphate. They came at him hard. And this is one of the dynamics in all this that is not really well understood in the analyses of Al-Qaeda-ISIS competition. But Al-Qaeda had cards to play in fighting back against the caliphate's push.
Yeah, exactly. And he certainly is a figure of stature. And one of the things he did just after 9/11, at the time of 9/11, he was running an Al-Qaeda training camp in the Tora Bora Mountains before the U.S. invasion. So this guy has a lot of sway, particularly with jihadists in the region. And, as far as the IMU goes...
He being Abdul Haq was helping to run that camp.
Abdul Haq, right. Yes, that's correct. And the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, it seems that it fractured. About half of it went to the Islamic State, and the other half, as you noted, was basically absorbed by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We saw some individuals released a statement about this. I want to say it was about 2 or 3 years ago, and they noted that, look, we're still around. The IMU that defected to the Islamic State, they took over the media department, so we really couldn't talk. But that was really the only statement that I've seen in some time of any consequence from the group. I think so any independent IMU obviously would have been an ally of the Taliban, and so our theory on that is that they were absorbed by the Taliban.
Yeah, we see other Uzbek groups like the Imam al-Bukhari brigades or battalion and that sort of thing pop up, and they may very well include former IMU guys too, Uzbeks. Sure. We'll get into that a little bit too at the end here again. But so now look, Abdul Haq al-Turkistani is alive and kicking. He's chastising Islamic State, going after anybody who goes into Baghdadi's fold or Baghdadi's camp. The TIP continues to fight on in Afghanistan. They migrate back. More of the fighters migrate out of northern Pakistan back into Afghanistan to basically take part in the jihad alongside the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But concurrently, the Turkistan Islamic Party builds this sizable arm in Syria, where they now have hundreds, perhaps thousands of fighters. Again, we're suspicious of any fighter counts. We don't really know how many, but it's a significant contingent just based on what we've been able to observe of their participation in the war fighting in Syria. And again, this further undermines the idea that it's a nationalist group, that the TIP is a nationalist group, right? Because if you're fighting in Afghanistan and Syria and northern Pakistan, there's nothing nationalist about that, And Abdul Haq actually at one point says, yeah, look, we're there, our guys are there to fight and support the jihad against Assad, but, always have an eye on possibly coming back and fighting the Chinese as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that shows the continuum of the global jihad, that basically it's not an either or from them in terms of at least how they're thinking about it. Now, the TIP's arm in Syria is a curious case study in some ways. One, you had the rivalry between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. The TIP, some of its members defected to the Islamic State in Syria, but they maintained their own branch, their own TIP branch in Syria that was still allied with Al-Qaeda. And now it still remains closely allied with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, despite all the problems between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which we'll refer to as HTS, and Al-Qaeda senior leadership. We got into a little bit of that in a previous episode. But as you know, we explained, Al-Qaeda's chain of command in Syria has been disrupted. It's not really clear to us anyway on the outside how this works at this point in time. We think there is a chain of command, but we're just not sure what exactly that looks like, and we haven't gotten any clarity from official U.S. sources on this. But even as the TIP has been closely allied with HTS, it's still, basically part of the Al-Qaeda web. There's no reason to believe it isn't. In fact, in 2018, the TIP Syrian arm came out with a video in which opened with this. It was all about trying to encourage hijra, or migration, to the lands of jihad in Syria. It opened with a quote from Osama bin Laden. It had video celebrating the 9/11 attacks. This is one of the many reasons why there's no evidence that it had left Al-Qaeda's web. And now here's the part, Bill, I wanted to get into about this, which is sort of speaks to what we've been doing at Long War Journal over the years. Because now I mentioned earlier how you got all nerded out when that 2015 video came out of Abdul Haq al-Turkistani, right? I got all nerded out when we saw this TIP-affiliated news site, Dogu Turkistani Bulletin, I think it was known as, right? Something like that. And they came out and they had this article in 2018 that we had translated that said that two veteran jihadists, these two guys, Abu Omar al-Turkistani and Abu Muhammad al-Turkistani, had been dispatched from Afghanistan to Syria, where they were going to take on leadership positions for the TIP in Syria. Now, Abu Omar was described as this military trainer, and he had served at the largest military camp under the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, meaning the Taliban. And it was in that role that he had reportedly contributed to many great operations, including by quote-unquote training thousands of Uyghur Mujahideen from the eastern Turkestan and Taliban Mujahideen. So again, here's an example of the TIP supporting and bolstering the Taliban's cause. And the other guy, Abu Muhammad al-Turkistani, that's a real original nom de guerre, right? That makes it easy for us, right, Bill?
Yeah,
Abu
that's the one. Look, I like the Turkistani jihadists. They have their own flair, like the Chechens, but boy, their naming conventions really makes it difficult for me to track them.
Yeah, I mean, Abu Omar and Abu Muhammad are not exactly the most distinctive nom de guerres we've ever covered. But in any event...
Yeah. And that gets to a point that you and I often joke about these jihadists. Not only are they evil, but they're inconsiderate. They often conduct attacks on days...
Weekends, Friday nights, Saturdays, we're trying to do nothing.
4th of July weekend. And then they can't even come up with naming conventions that can distinguish them so we can
I would appreciate greatly if the TIP would clarify its chain of command both in Afghanistan and Syria for us. That'd be great if they could do that.
It would be nice. But again, they're inconsiderate bastards.
Yeah, so going back to this TIP-affiliated news site, they also describe Abu Muhammad al-Turkistani as somebody who came from the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, meaning the Taliban, and was known for his decade-plus, quote-unquote, operational experience because of his supposedly sharp-witted mind and tactical maneuvers. And this had resulted, allegedly, in many successful direct joint operations carried out by many Taliban and Uyghur Turks in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So again, this article affiliated with the TIP was basically burnishing their credentials, this pair's jihadi credentials, by saying, look at everything good they did for the Taliban, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, before they went to Syria. Now, why did I say this is sort of teasing the work we do at Long War Journal? Because I wrote this up, and I included a screenshot and included some translated portions of it and everything. And what happened, Bill? This website was taken down almost immediately. Yeah, right?
We see this happen. Like, it's almost like we're the only ones looking at it and reporting on it at some time.
Sometimes that's true. Sometimes we're the only ones looking at certain stuff, and the Taliban does this too with us. There are times where we report something or just saying what they're saying, just reporting on what they're saying, and there's sort of this perverse thing where we're watching them and they're watching us watch them, and so they take stuff down, right?
Exactly. Just happened with the Turkistan Islamic Party. We talked about that, I believe, we're
going to mention that at the end here, too.
Yeah,
we're going to do that at the end of the podcast, too. Yeah, it happens with the Taliban on this stuff. But here's the point, was that this article came out in which they're talking about these two guys being shipped from Afghanistan to Syria to lead the TIP's causes there. Well, what does that mean? I mean, who knows? I mean, what does that involve? The infighting that was then raging between HTS and other al-Qaeda groups in Syria? Probably. Maybe. But again, this speaks to the uncertainty here in evaluating all this stuff. And how do these guys fit into al-Qaeda's global scheme, in terms of what is their rank, and serial number, let's say. We already talked about the problems with the names, but what are their rank and serial numbers in al-Qaeda's scheme? How do they fit into the whole global army that al-Qaeda has built through the decades? And we don't know, but, here's this news site affiliated with the TIP saying, basically cheering on the fact these two guys are going to go lead the charge. Now, here's the thing about this. Even after all these several years now of problems between HTS and al-Qaeda senior leadership, the TIP is one of these curious case studies where it both overtly is still affiliated with al-Qaeda in both Syria and Afghanistan, and yet is close to HTS in Syria. You have any thoughts on that, Bill?
Yeah, I think it's trying to... I noticed this with the Chechen groups, with the IMU or the Emin Barkari or the TIP. They seem to like to straddle the fence and serve as mediators for these types of problems. It's the only maybe it's because they're not large enough to really weigh in heavily. Maybe they have to hedge, do a little hedging to make sure, they don't overcommit to a losing side. I don't really know. I'm only guessing, but in my opinion, I think these are very serious jihadist groups, and they tend to just sort of put their nose to the grindstone and wage their jihad. And I suspect that some of the politics that goes on in some of this may be distasteful. Again, I'm only theorizing here. I'm going to go back to that example. I know we're going to talk about it later. Look, there, where the Taliban, denied our report on the TIP, training with, and fighting alongside the Taliban. From the TIP's perspective, they're just issuing a report on what they're doing. The Taliban has a greater interest in obscuring these types of links. So one's operating purely from a communications/military standpoint. Hey, here's what we're doing and where the Taliban's saying, hey, don't say this because this really complicates the political situation, because we can't look like we're sponsoring global, foreign terrorist groups inside of Afghanistan. So that's just my guess there, Tom. And one further thing.
That's a damn good guess, I would say. I think that's a pretty apt analysis, actually, of what it is.
But listen, I have nothing to base it on other than just watching this. I mean, you never really see these groups as a whole take a side. I mean, maybe the Islamic State with when a significant the Caucasus Emirates group kind of split over that.
Well, the TIP took a side in the Islamic State Al-Qaeda rivalry.
Yeah, right.
The TIP came down firmly on Al-Qaeda's side, but it didn't. It with this internal
the
baseball,
internal, right? That's
inside baseball stuff. They seemed to basically try and punt. I mean, the thing about the TIP was when I remember when the Al-Qaeda guys, some of the Al-Qaeda guys in Syria were trying to level this charge against Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the head of HTS, saying that he and his men were not really all that great when it came to hosting foreign fighters. The TIP was very quick to sign on to statements saying, no, they're wonderful with foreign fighters.
Right.
So they basically were very quick to sort of defend Jawlani's credentials in that regard, which I thought was interesting. And you have other things too. We talk about the inside baseball here. There was one of the other things we noticed in 2018. This guy Abu Zar al-Burmi, who I'd written up, otherwise known as Abu Dar, he was a former IMU ideologue, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan ideologue. He also had ties to the Pakistani Taliban. Again, he's another guy, another character on the wheel of jihad in South and Central Asia. And he came out with a statement. Now, he initially defected to the Islamic State or had joined the Islamic State, but then they talked him out of it, apparently, and he came back to the Al-Qaeda fold. And so in 2018, he releases this message basically warning Uyghur jihadists and others to stay out of the infighting in Syria. This message from an ideologue in South Asia saying to guys in Syria, hey, don't get involved in this infighting between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Al-Qaeda parties in Idlib. Which again showed you that basically they wanted, at least as a matter of operating policy, they wanted to sort of have a stand down. They didn't really want to get involved in what could potentially become another disastrous fitna or discord for them, internal strife for them in Syria.
Yeah, it's almost like he's saying, hey guys, give them the space to sort out their internal problems. Let's not make it a bigger problem by you getting involved. I want to get back to Tom, if I may, just one point. Sure. On the two TIP guys sent from the Afghanistan-Pakistan region to Syria. Now, again, this might be something that the Taliban would deny, but that is, we had a report even before this came out from the TIP that the TIP was training at a Taliban camp in Badashan province in northeastern Afghanistan. The U.S. conducted an airstrike and specifically identified the TIP in this strike. And so, I always find it humorous when we have all the evidence we need and the Taliban will still sit there and say, well, we haven't had a foreign fighter in Afghanistan since pre 9/11.
Yeah, well, actually gets us to the next point on this. We can move on to the next point, which is that this airstrike in early 2018. Right. That was the next thing on the list here. We're talking about these training camps in Badakhshan. The UN reports on this, documents the TIP's role in the fighting in Badakhshan, has even named some of its leaders, and identified the sort of few hundred fighters are thought to be there. Again, we don't really buy any of the fighter counts. But the U.S. goes and they bomb these Taliban camps in Badakhshan. Talk a little bit about that, Bill, because here's another example of where, according to the U.S. military, here you have the TIPs embedded within these Taliban camps, training alongside there. More recently, by the way, we have Afghan officials from Badakhshan pointing to the ongoing presence here in 2020 of foreign fighters there in Badakhshan. I don't have any reason to doubt the TIP is still there. We haven't seen the Taliban do anything to eject them, let alone, we haven't seen them do anything to recognize the TIPs there, let alone eject them from there.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about the bombing of his camps. I thought it was weird, right? At the time, the Defense Department referred to as Eastern Turkistan Islamic Movement, or ETIM, which is sort of the older name of the group. It's really, the TIP is really how it's more commonly referred to today.
Yeah, it's always interesting how they shuttle back and forth between the naming conventions. I just wish someone, would pick them, just like the TIP seems to pick their nom de guerre as being Al-Turkistani. Maybe the U.S. Department of Defense intelligence community could just pick on a single name for this group. But yeah, it was really interesting, particularly at the time. This strike, Badakhshan province, there's several districts there where the Taliban controlled the districts, and this is a very remote area. It's in northeastern Afghanistan. It borders Pakistan and China. It's as rural as it gets. Maybe like Kunar province might be more rural. I'm not sure. But you had this strike take place. The Department of Defense, or U.S. Forces Afghanistan, reported on it. They noted that this camp was that TIP members were attending and operating in this training camp by the Taliban. By the way, the Taliban has admitted that it's operating a training camp inside of Badakhshan province. But they'll claim that no, there was no. I think if I recall at the time, they issued a denial on this as well. And it was funny too when this came out, Tom. You had some analysts out there trying to completely discount the fact that the TIP is in Afghanistan, and they made this whole convoluted argument. Remember this? We were discussing this a while back.
Yeah, I didn't even want to credit these jokers with any sort of airtime here, basically. But I know what you're talking about.
Come to the conclusion.
Their own reporting documented that the TIP was there. That was the idiocy of that whole thing.
Right.
Which is why I didn't want to bother with it.
They make an argument against it, and then they give you, and then they explain why the TIP is there.
I interviewed these people. I don't think the TIP is really there, but I interviewed these people saying the TIP is there. Okay, thanks.
And the military's saying they're there. The TIP's saying they're there. But we don't think they're there.
Just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.
The TIP, though, there's a fair amount of disconnected dot stuff surrounding the TIP, and that's the point. And that's been there 3 years too.
It's a common theme that just persists in just about every theater. Maybe Somalia might be the only one that I detect where I don't see people trying to say Shabab isn't part of Al-Qaeda. Although that's not true too. We've had that. It's one of the more frustrating things that we have to deal with anyway.
Yeah, because the most ridiculous part of this too, right, is that I think a lot of this is motivated by people wanting to sort of argue that the U.S. military doesn't need to take an active role in places like Afghanistan, right? Sort of the subtext is, they're just pointing to the TIP's presence because they're warmongers and they want to justify war. To be honest with you, who the heck are calling for war in Afghanistan based on the TIP? Most Americans don't even know what the TIP is. I don't even think most Defense Department officials know what the TIP is.
Yeah.
It's just sort of funny that the Taliban and sort of Taliban apologists and people who are against U.S. military action, they sort of are very desperate to sort of downplay the role of a group like this or dismiss it for convoluted reasons, as far as I'm concerned, because nobody's actually arguing that the U.S. needs to be there to fight the TIP, right?
As a matter of fact, most of the Department of Defense really doesn't want to fight these wars. If there's anything we've learned particularly over the last decade.
But even if they did want to fight the war, I don't think they understand TIP.
This isn't the argument they would make, right?
Right. Even when they did want to fight the war, Bill, let me put it this way, because I had this argument with a Pentagon lawyer back in 2008. Even when they did want to fight the war, they didn't understand the TIP. Yeah, they didn't.
Right. If you wanted to fight wars, right, like you would be a war, let's say a Pentagon-friendly war. I don't think there's such a thing because we can't win wars in places where we should be able to stomp our enemies. But, they'd be highlighting every day, every second of every day, say, Al-Qaeda sheltering inside of Iran and conducting operations from within Iran. Like, that's a war that, there is, some support in Washington for that,
Supposedly. I think that gets overblown. I think there's been this idea that the U.S. has been angling, or some people in the U.S. have been angling for war with Iran. I want to do this in a separate episode. I don't want to get off on this tangent here because I mean, look, we're here sitting here in 2020, and I've heard since 2006 or 2003 or whatever, the U.S. is going to war with Iran. It didn't happen,
Well, so I mean, my whole point with that,
it gets to be a tired old song at some point.
My point on that, Tom, is it hasn't happened.
Right.
So they're not even pushing for that one, trying to build the case for war, let alone trying to say we need to invade Afghanistan to go after the TIP. That was the whole point of that. Not saying that that's actually
I think what you're trying to get at is basically, and this is something I want to talk about when we talk about Iran in a future episode. And I don't, we'll just leave it, put a punctuation on this, and move back to the TIP. This stuff shouldn't always be seen through the prism of trying to justify war or this or that. You need to bifurcate your analysis of what's going on and then have a discussion about what to do about it, And the TIP is a good example of that. I don't think anybody's, looking to basically prolong America's military presence in Afghanistan because of the TIP. Now, on the other hand, I do think you have to factor in the TIP in any assessment of Al-Qaeda and what it's doing, and the U.S. has to protect itself against Al-Qaeda. So,
look, Tom, if it was just the TIP was the only terrorist threat emanating from Afghanistan,
right? There's plenty of others.
That wouldn't be justification for a war in Afghanistan. Right. The problem is they're allied with the Taliban, they're part of Al-Qaeda, So it's part. What we're doing here is trying to explain the entire threat. The TIP is a part of it, and that's what makes them a threat. If it was just 500 TIP fighters who were primarily concerned about conducting attacks inside of China, that's not really a vital U.S. interest. And
but that gets to why I think we alluded to the disconnect the daughters, the people who play disconnect the daughters, were like, that's what drives their analysis, right? Is basically they're trying to explain it as, during this podcast we took a couple of swipes at anybody who would describe this as a nationalist group, right? Because it clearly isn't a nationalist group, but that's where that comes from, is basically trying to picture this group as something other than what it is to justify inaction by the U.S. military. Right. So, and that's actually what I'm saying is that's the stronger analytical urge here than trying to use this group like this it's not that people are running around trying to use this group to justify military action. I think there are people trying to downplay it in order to basically invalidate military action in Afghanistan. So in any event, let's go back to this. So Abdul Haq, let's go back to the main theme of this podcast, which is, Chinese oppression in Xinjiang. Abdul Haq al-Turkistani himself has spoken out about this. In March 2019, he released a message in which he addressed Habatul Akhundzada, that's the Taliban honcho, the Taliban's main emir. He's known as the emir of the faithful for the Taliban. And Abdul Haq also addressed Ayman al-Zawahiri, and he name-checked a bunch of al-Qaeda clerics. They released this sort of goofy little image with all their heads on it. I had posted it at Long War Journal at the time. Yeah. And Abdul Haq basically was blasting the Chinese government for its oppression in Xinjiang and going and sort of what was going on with Muslims there, and was calling for all these jihadis, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, to come to his aid and come to the TIP's aid and support the cause. Now, basically in the way that his message was marketed, again, this is March 2019, it was absolutely crystal clear that it was part of the Taliban Al-Qaeda axis or nexus. Absolutely crystal clear the way, again, with these goofy little head images. And actually, you go through all the clerics that are on the images that the TIP put out with that message, and you could see who they consider to be part of the Al-Qaeda network, including guys in Syria, Canada, London. These are all clerics that are part of the Al-Qaeda global network. And so how did Al-Qaeda respond? Well, just a few days later, or maybe a week or two later, a couple weeks later, Al-Qaeda senior leadership responded with a strong message, declaring its solidarity with the TIP and praising Abdul Haq's leadership and basically saying, you're right, we need to do more to sort of combat Chinese oppression in Xinjiang and sort of go after them. I think that's sort of still a long-term goal, is for them to do more in China in that regard. But again, it was sort of this back and forth. Again, this is early 2019. Showing how the TIP is part of the Al-Qaeda network. You don't have this exchange of messages. You don't have the TIP, Abdul Haq, calling for more support from Al-Qaeda, and then Al-Qaeda quickly sort of saluting him and saying, yes, you deserve it, unless he's firmly within the Al-Qaeda fold after all these years. Right, Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a prime example. This is, if this isn't orchestrated, I would, let's put it this way. I'd put a good bit of money that this was orchestrated. The two statements were released within 4 weeks of each other. And they're hitting on the same themes, and this is just part of, it's just
now. I will say this about it. I will say this about it, though. The Abdul Haq's original message, which we translated, it did seem a little bit like he was disappointed in the support that he thought the TIP wasn't getting from the international jihadis in terms of going after China. Maybe he was trying to urge them to do more. Now, maybe it was a rhetorical stunt to try and get all these people to genuflect, And the Taliban didn't officially say anything about this through their channels on any of their sites. They're playing the game where they're not going to recognize any of this, at least publicly. But Al-Qaeda did, and that was interesting. And, of course, the Taliban didn't do anything to disclaim the TIP and still hasn't disclaimed the TIP after all this time. Now, which brings us to sort of the final part of this story here on the TIP. They do occasionally still advertise their role in the fighting in Afghanistan. But this, as Bill alluded to earlier, embarrasses the Taliban. And in fact, the Taliban continues to lie about the presence of TIP in Afghanistan. Here's another example. So Caleb, our guy, Caleb Weiss, a grad student, writes for us. Good guy. We're going to have him on the show in the future here to talk about his experience and all this. I think it's going to be somewhat funny, given what we have planned for that episode. He wrote up a simple thing in December of last year, saying, here's what the TIP is saying about its operations in Afghanistan alongside the Taliban. And immediately, Zabihullah Mujahid, the Taliban spokesman, probably several people who operate under that nom de guerre, but his Twitter account anyway, comes out and immediately decries this as lies. It's all lies. There are no foreign fighters in Afghanistan. These are just jihadis who are operating as part of the Islamic Emirate. Now, it's just so funny, right? Because, first of all, the only people who are talking about this are us, right?
Yeah.
About what first of all, the Turkistan Islamic Party reports it. We just say what the Turkistan Islamic Party is saying. That's all Caleb did. He just said, here's what the Turkistan Islamic Party is saying, right? And, nobody, do you think the State Department and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo or Zalmay Khalilzad or any of these other people who have been tasked with these negotiations with the Taliban, you think that they, at this time, we're talking about 2019, we're going to change courses based on this Long War Journal post discussing the TIP in Afghanistan? No, of course not. It's ridiculous. They're not going to backtrack on any of that stuff. And yet the Taliban, which they need a lesson in PR, it would have been better for them to just ignore it, and not say anything. But actually, I'm glad they didn't. I'm glad they came out and sort of had to make this ridiculous statement or issue a statement about it, because it shows that they continue to lie about Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Afghanistan. After all this time, they're still lying about it. Because there's no real doubt that the Turkistan Islamic Party is there, right, Bill? I mean, there's nobody really doubts that they're there.
No, look, the Turkistan Islamic Party's own Emir put out those pictures. So the Taliban, in essence, is calling the TIP's Emir a liar in this.
That's the Uzbek guy. That's the Uzbek Emir did that.
I'm sorry. That's right. You're right. That was the Uzbek Emir, right?
That's the next part of yours.
Right. I'm sorry. I conflated the two. Yeah.
Right. No, this actually, who put out the pictures was on the TIP's official website.
Yeah, it was on their official
TIP's
website. Yeah,
Telegram channels, social media. Yeah, it was all because I saw it too before Caleb wrote it up. It was all just official stuff, So now what happened? So that was December of last year. Then you flash forward to July of this year. This is what you're talking about, Bill, was with the Emir. We mentioned this previously too. The Emir of the Imam al-Bukhari brigade or battalion, or whatever they refer to themselves as, in Syria, actually posted images from Afghanistan showing these Uzbek jihadists, again, who probably have worked with the TIP in the past. But anyway, these Uzbek jihadists working with the Taliban in Afghanistan as part of this sort of raid in Afghanistan where they kidnapped some guys or holding them hostage or holding them prisoner. And again, the Taliban did the same thing and got all crazy, got all about this and put out a statement saying, "Oh, these are all lies," and somebody raided our archives and stole these photos. It's just the Islamic Emirate Afghanistan fighters again. But again, just like with the TIP photos, it was this Imam al-Bukhari group that was posting this, not us. It wasn't a Long War Journal. I don't think you have any hacking skills, Bill. I know I don't. No. I know Caleb doesn't, right? I could barely get my computer to work most days.
Tom is a walking EMP, just in case you want to.
Yeah, if you want your computer to shut down, you just send me near it. In fact, I always joke, like, if you want to stop the North Korean missile launches, just parachute my ass in there, and I'll get me anywhere near it, and the missiles will probably fizzle on the platform. But that's the point, right? Is that it's just sort of ridiculous that they would go out of their way to lie about this stuff. But look, I think to wrap this up for this week, here's the bottom line: Turkistan Islamic Party still has probably thousands of fighters across Afghanistan and Syria. Bill, you think thousands? I know we're always suspicious of numbers, but I think that's probably a good guess.
I think it's
right?
reasonable. Look, they've said, they've claimed that they've hundreds and thousands of fighters gone through camps. I think there's more than, this group has been, it's withstood the test of time. I don't see any reason to doubt those numbers are reasonable.
the top leaders had a generation here to recruit members. A whole generation here.
And things certainly aren't getting better in China when it comes to these groups. No. They certainly have a wider, more sympathetic base to recruit from. So I don't see any reason why they couldn't have 500, 1,000, or 2,000 fighters within their ranks. I think they're all, I'm just talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan right there, and probably another 1,000 or more in Syria.
Yeah, and I think if we had a forecast going forward, I would expect them to do more to follow up on Chinese repression and what's going on in Xinjiang and try and capitalize on that to get more disaffected Muslims who have their children stolen from them or have family members sort of placed in some sort of horrible detention camp or enforced labor or have their sisters or mothers raped by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, this is sort of, if you want to set up an ideal incubator for jihadism and how to recruit and give oppressive tactics for jihadis to exploit, again, trying to refract this through the lens of the ideology, the local grievances through that ideological lens. The Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, they're doing a good job of it, I think. Now, it doesn't mean that the Turkistan Islamic Party and Al-Qaeda will be successful or the Islamic State will be successful. They've also written about this in Anaba, their weekly newsletter, trying to capitalize on this as well, trying to exploit it. Doesn't mean they'll be successful in getting thousands of people to try come into their ranks. Sometimes the tyrant wins. But this is the dynamic that we're talking about here. That basically this is a type of policies that where the Chinese government likes to say they're fighting terrorists, but quite frankly, when I look at this, I think that a lot of their policies are much more geared toward disaffecting, basically radicalizing people and ginning up anger than they are really fighting terrorism.
Yeah, the Chinese policy is definitely directed at anyone who is not adhering to the communist state ideology. They view them as a threat. That's why this is being done. And like you said, they're creating all the conditions for the Turkistan Islamic Party and possibly the Islamic State to capitalize it and have a sympathetic audience, a sympathetic population that may actually feed into the recruiting of these groups.
Yeah, and I'll just say this too on our way out here this week. PBS Frontline did an incredible special on the oppression in Xinjiang, and it's just chilling, absolutely chilling. And you look at the people in that episode. If you think that those people are jihadists, then you're out of your mind because they're not, And you can just see that they just want to go about their daily lives. And to have a husband basically is on the border of China trying to see what inquire about the fate of his wife or other loved ones. I mean, it's just heartbreaking to watch that type of stuff. And so, yeah.
I'll just add this, Tom, the silence in the U.S. on this issue from groups like the NBA that capitalizes on the Chinese market and U.S. businesses. This is horrific. We have all the evidence that Chinese by the hundreds of thousands at a time are being put through concentration camps. Or re-education camps, whatever you want to call them, and the media silence and business silence. It's not the media. Media is reporting on this. I apologize for that. But the silence of businesses on this issue, and they'll take up lesser issues, is just pretty disgusting. And
not only that, but what about all the Muslim majority countries, Muslim majority governments that aren't decrying Chinese behavior here?
Yeah, China's getting a pass.
That's where the hypocrisy really gets exposed because we started off by talking about Guantanamo and the research done in Guantanamo. Look, that's a complicated topic. We'll do another podcast on that. I'm not excusing everything that took place at Guantanamo, but Guantanamo was never even close to the scale of this, and many of the guys at Guantanamo, many of the detainees at Guantanamo, as President Obama's own commission found, own sort of investigative work found, were actually jihadists of one form or another. There weren't a ton of innocent goat herders down there, some of the media coverage would have you believe. Very different situation between Guantanamo and these concentration camps in China, and yet you can see, the U.S. took an awful lot of flack for Guantanamo from people who are now silent about these concentration camps in China, and that speaks to anti-Americanism as a force, and to really some of the ongoing challenges the U.S. is going to have going forward, trying to push its interests and its values, and basically promulgate and sponsor sort of the types of values that we want to see around the world. So. And with that cheery note, as again, I warn you guys, I warn our listeners, we are not the place you come for happy talk. That's not what Generation Jihad is all about. But I'll leave you on one last leave you note, which is I'm sure Phil would want me to ask you again to rate us on your Apple Podcast app. Can I get a thumbs up on Zoom here, Phil, as you're listening to all this? Yeah, thumbs up. All right, good. So, and Bill says it too. So if you're out there, give us 5 stars on your Apple Podcast app. I don't even have the Apple Podcast app, by the way. That's how much of a tech phobe I am. But
it wouldn't work anyway, Tom.
I probably would shut down. But
what is internet anyway? What do you mean? How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
Go ahead and do that for us to drive more people to the show. We're going to have more guests on in the future. We have many shows lined up. We've got a lot of different content we're going to be bringing your way. But we're always thankful for you guys out there who are listening to us. We know we have a great audience. We know we have a very engaged audience. We know we have a lot of people out there who are really into this stuff and appreciate the sort of nerdy, in the weeds detail we try and bring you. The show is supposed to be a little bit off the cuff, if you hadn't guessed. We try and script a little bit about what we're going to talk about, but Bill and I just basically like to get on this and just sort of just basically gab at each other for an hour or an hour and a half. But we're going to do that with some more guests in the future too, and we hope you guys are enjoying the show. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows, and we will see you again next week.